as you're probably all aware, IFRS S1 and S2 kind of are formalizing sustainability reporting standards. So they were developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is kind of a sister organization to the International Accounting Standards Board. And that relationship alone means that they're much more connected into the expectations and the kind of the requirements of accounting standards. And for me, this is the kind of first step of where the whole nature of reporting changes and becomes a lot more formalized and a lot more kind of strict and a lot more aligned with how financial reporting currently works. So for UK entities, the S2, so that's the climate standard, is going to be coming in first, most likely from 1st of January 2027. And then there'll be a 2-year transitional relief for S1, which is the more broad sustainability reporting standards. Those will only be required on a comply or explain basis, whereas climate's much more likely to be mandatory. And as I said, there's a big kind of piece of work relating to connectivity. So even though they are based on TCFD and they're kind of an extension and a push forward on TCFD, there is a greater connectivity required with the financial reporting elements. So much more kind of line by line considerations. And the way that we kind of saw TCFD was that they were much more disclosure focused and often sustainability led. So it was really corporates kind of getting to grips with what climate risk meant for their organizations, but they do kind of remain a bit more standalone and disconnected from broader decision making and from operational realities of companies. S2 is much more kind of integral to the financial kind of remit. So there's the connectivity that I talked about between finance and sustainability, and there's kind of requirements to report on current and anticipated financial effects. So it's kind of moving the bar forward. And I've included this AFRS maturity map just because it's quite a helpful kind of checklist. So to have a look at what you're reporting against and to see where there might be areas where you need to kind of push your own work a bit further forward. And it can be quite helpful to think about it as, so TCFD or financial reporting is kind of backward looking. So that reports on what has happened, whereas the sustainability reporting is thinking about what could happen, but it should tell one coherent story about the business. And so it kind of changes the questions that you need to be thinking about. So it's not necessarily just about scenario analysis and what could the effects be over the short, medium, long term, but it's also about kind of how carbon pricing could affect valuations, how physical risks might impact impairments, whether you need to kind of put provisions in for repairs or thinking about how kind of key commodity prices might shift and thinking about how you're going to be managing those risks. So it's much more broad and it's much more kind of specific. And nature reporting, whilst that's still evolving, a lot of companies are kind of trying to think about it whilst they're thinking about climate, because there is a lot of crossover. The frameworks are kind of similar with regard to IFRS and TNFD. And it's probably important to note that I think some organizations were expecting a kind of S3 standard for nature. That isn't going to happen. There will be a practice statement issued to kind of give some insight into how to report against nature, which is likely to be inspired by TNFD. But S1 will cover nature. So if nature is material to your organization, then there will be a requirement to talk about it under that standard. And so thinking about how companies are doing this, there's no one right approach. There's many different platforms which meet multiple different needs. From our perspective, you need to match up both the top-down perspective, so a kind of central look over the whole business, but also connect it with the bottom-up approach. So making sure that the top-down analysis helps you to kind of focus on what might be most important to your organization and to narrow down on hotspots of risk, but then using the bottom-up to kind of use the knowledge from the organization. So the operational managers, the site managers, the engineers, the people who kind of see these problems being crystallized as they're happening on the ground. Ultimately, what we're kind of aiming to get to is better business decisions and better resilience. So that's the kind of objective, which I'm sure all of you are kind of aware of. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Johannes Wassenberg, who's our guest speaker today. So Johannes comes from Moody's and has a lot of experience as a risk practitioner. So I'd be delighted to hand over and share his slides for you.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to address this illustrious audience. So a quick background on me. I worked most of my life in a risk role, first at Deutsche Bank, then at Moody's. I was then, among others, the head of the corporate finance team in Frankfurt, Moscow, and Prague. Then later on was the head of the European banking team, and then actually was the COO of Moody's ESG Solutions. Some of you may have come across them. We made acquisitions of Vigio Iris and 427, so ESG rating agency, physical risk company. And I then actually 2 years ago, set up my own company startup called Quant Risk Analytics. And I'll talk to you a bit about what we do. But I think Helen has, shown a bit the trajectory, I think, of regulatory reporting, how it moves into the risk space. And we're really in that risk space, right? We're not a regulatory reporting solution, to be very clear, but we are sort of operating the risk space. But that's, I think, was my aha moment when I worked with the former colleagues of Vigio Iris, and then we've set up Moody's ESG Solutions. I think for me, there are two risk vectors that companies are confronted with. One, of course, is physical risk, and I think a lot of you probably very much in control of that, or very much advanced on that in terms of how physical risk, chronic, acute, etc., how that is impacting your business. But I think for me, there's another risk vector, and that is actually something I think Helen alluded to briefly, which is the internalization of negative externalities. That may sound a bit theoretical, and again, I think some of you are probably quite familiar with that, but just a background, I mean, those are costs that companies were able to offload onto supply chain, onto the environment, onto society at large, etc. And actually, I realized I think these costs are coming back. They're not coming back because we all suddenly have a higher ethical standard to which we operate to, but actually because there's some real secular shifts that are happening. The reasons why externalities, negative externalities, exist in the first place, because they were not material, they were not measurable, you couldn't allocate them, you weren't held accountable for them. All these reasons actually have changed or are changing. With population growth, I mean, you know the stats, right? From 2 billion in 1950 to now 8.5 billion, going to 11 billion by the end of the century. Things that weren't material have become material. You couldn't measure some of this. Now with technological advances, satellite imagery, etc., you can not just measure, but you can also even allocate pollution, etc., to the source, to the company that is causing them. And with social media, of course, you create a degree of accountability. That means that these externalities, these costs that companies created but weren't held accountable for, are coming back. And that's not a moral discussion. It's not an ethical discussion. This is just a fact. Right? The challenge, of course, is that a lot of these costs are expressed or are felt sometimes as idiosyncratic event risks rather than as symptoms of this underlying change. Right? You have obviously transmission mechanism, regulation. You have obviously innovation, very important one. You have risk underwriters, insurance companies, etc., raising prices or not even insuring. You have many different transmission mechanisms that are felt as this. But I think what is really important to understand that this is basically a cost that is coming your way. And as Helen said, moving from looking what has happened to looking what's going to happen, I think businesses need to be able to quantify these costs and really have this added to their management information tools, to the language that they're speaking. So it really then feeds, and we can see on this slide, all the different needs of the company, whether that's the finance need for long-term capital allocation, for making decisions about mergers and acquisitions. You need to understand not just what the historical performance of these assets has been, but what's costs and what performance lies in store. Equally, risk. I mean, I've as I've worked in risk in all my life, and I've seen risk only really gets addressed and managed if you can actually quantify it. If it's just on a heat map, red, amber, green, or whatever it is, it's going to be so much more difficult to actually manage that. And from a procurement perspective, sometimes we're working with, they really like that suddenly you're not just looking at, sort of, let's say, a questionnaire and some ESG rating for a supplier, but you actually are able to really put some hard numbers on what additional risk and costs are they contributing. Because as we all know, the large part of the exposure lies, and depending where you are, upstream, sometimes also downstream, but lies in your value chain. And then lastly, I think for the sustainability people, you and others, I think it gives them that language that is spoken at the top table, right? It gives you the language that gives you your audience back in a way that makes you understood and heard by your internal audience, whether it's the board, whether it's the other C-suite functions. So that's what we are basically focusing on, really speaking that language, modeling those costs. And as I said, and if you go to the next slide, Helen, where you can see first of all, the 4 dimensions that we're covering, you can see here, basically just explain this a bit. You see, model EBITDA at the moment, we just taken the whole horizon until 2050. Now we can model that for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, depending how long you want, until 2050 at the moment. So you see the net present value of EBITDA of a company. You see the carbon, or greenhouse gas CO2 equivalent emission and the costs related to that. You see the chronic physical risks that the company is facing. And then importantly, you can see actually how this company, it's a fashion company, is not actually exposed directly gate to gate for the cost of water, the cost of land. But if you then include its upstream supply chain, you can see how that is really challenging, I think, its business model, how EBITDA is becoming a fraction. Again, these are 25-year NPVs, but even if you look at this over a shorter time horizon, then the relations are very similar, the proportions are very similar. So you can see sort of how this is impacting your business. And what's really important, I think, for us is to be able to then show, we can show that in a follow-up session if you're interested, but our model is extremely transparent. So you can understand how these numbers are computed. So there's no black box AI in the number. We use AI then for you to basically extract information, but the calculation of those numbers is extremely transparent. The origin data source, and then the 3, 4, 5 steps of manipulation of the data to get to the output. You can see exactly what each step is doing, where the data is coming from, etc. So you have confidence in the way these numbers, these costs are computed, because of course we know they're going to be wrong, because anything you try to model, it's not going to be the accurate, precise number that it will end up being. But I think you need to be comfortable with seeing how this has been derived. So really that transparency in this deterministic calculation, I think, is extremely important. And what we also believe, and this shows a really good case, you need to understand first what your, let's say, cost of inaction is, what your baseline is, against which you can then plan your adaptation, plan your transition. Right? If you basically said, okay, our biggest exposure is physical risk, if you just looked at gate to gate, obviously you'd realize actually your biggest exposure is land. So it may bring you a very different perspective if you look at this a bit more holistically. And again, it's obviously expressed in financial language. So something that really the whole company can understand and coalesce around and act upon. So that's perhaps finalizing my very short comments initially. And if you're interested, I said, Helen and I are very happy to take obviously questions on that and also explain more. But I think what's really critical for me is what you say here. It needs to be sort of expressed in the language of the business. And as I said, I've analyzed businesses for 25 years. I know, it's the language of finance that basically is the blood that trickles through the business's veins, and you need to be able to speak the language of finance. It needs to be clear and transparent. And with that, I think I'll hand back to Helen for any questions and further discussions.
Great, thank you, Johannes.